Today we have a special video for you guys. It'll be a collection of 4 fan favorites about supernatural encounters. These stories have all been completely re-edited, so even if you have heard or seen them before, it'll be a brand new viewing experience. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is doing stand-up comedy, as they're getting ready to deliver a joke, yell out the punchline. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. In 2006, Susan Lewis and her daughter Jamie moved into a new home in Southern California. It was this nice little house that they referred to as their sanctuary. They loved it there. And shortly after moving in, Susan's new boyfriend, Matt, he moved in as well. Matt and Jamie got along great. Also, Matt had a daughter named Marie, who was the same age as Jamie. And so those two got along great. Susan and Matt are getting along great. One happy family living in this beautiful little home that they call their sanctuary. I mean, it's a charmed life. Everything would change when the peanut butter spilled. A few weeks after moving in, it's this beautiful summer day, and Matt and Jamie and Marie are all outside goofing around in the pool, and Susan steps away from them to go into the house to make lunch for the group. Susan goes into the kitchen, and she sees on the counter that a peanut butter jar had its lid off and had been turned on its side. And oddly enough, the peanut butter seemed to be running out of the jar like it had been melted. It was like in a liquid state, pouring out of the jar and had gone all over the ground. She felt the temperature in the air and it wasn't very hot. So she figures one of the kids must have come in here and for whatever reason, microwaved the peanut butter and then dumped it on the counter. And so she reflexively turns around. She's like, Jamie, her daughter, Jamie, get in here. Jamie comes inside and she's like, what, Mom? And she's like, did you do this? And Jamie would say that she literally laughed at her mom. Like, why would I do that? And her mom's like, well, I don't know. Do you know if Marie did this? And she's like, no, we've been outside. So she shoos her daughter away and she calls in Marie. And Marie too is like, no, I didn't touch the peanut butter. Susan ultimately just kind of says, okay, the kids don't want to own up to it. It's a great day today. I'm not gonna let this ruin it. And so she's kind of rationalizing what's going on. She's thinking, okay, one of the kids must have knocked it over without meaning to, and maybe it was warmer in here and I just didn't realize it and it melted. Any number of things could have been the reason for this, but I just don't care. After cleaning up the peanut butter, Susan leaves the house and they, all 4 of them, spend the rest of the day goofing around outside near the pool. When they come back in the house later that day, they find that there have been cans that you would keep in your pantry, like canned food, stacked on each of the steps leading upstairs. They also find that there have been random objects placed all over the house in strange patterns. In the bathroom, they find shampoo bottles stacked on top of one another, hairbrushes arranged in a star pattern on the counter. They open the microwave and find peanut butter jars and other random canned foods and stuffed animals from the kids' rooms in the microwave. The cleaning materials underneath the sink had been pulled out and arranged in a height line from shortest to tallest on the kitchen floor. Also, there were just strange liquids all over the walls. It looked like maybe ketchup or other sauces. They couldn't really tell what it was, but it was sprayed all over the house. There was shampoo on the walls and soap on the walls. And so when Susan and Matt and the girls go inside, they think that someone's invaded their house. So they run back out again. They're kind of looking around the property, wondering what they should do. And no one's come near their property. And they would have seen someone come to their property. So they start filming it. They go in and they film what's going on. That's why we have all these pictures. And they have no idea what to make of this. Matt believes it's Jamie, so not his biological daughter. Susan believes it's his daughter, Marie, and it starts this awful conflict between Matt and Susan. This would be the start of what would turn out to be a major fracture in this family, because it just continued to grow. You got to put yourself in their position. If you're Matt or Susan, you don't want this to be anything other than one of the kids did this. If it's not one of the kids, it means you had an intruder in your home. If it's not an intruder, then what caused it? They believe that the other child is doing this. They believed it so much that they did not see reason. But more than that, it would keep Matt and Susan from handling this the way I think anyone should have, which is get the police involved. They don't. So they start cleaning it up, and the house was really a mess. So it took quite a while to clean it up. And they ultimately just kind of moved on in that way that people who are in denial move on because you're in denial. That's what they were doing. So a week passes since finding their house in disarray with cans and jars all over the place and liquids on the walls. And Jamie and Marie are spending some time together in Jamie's room. Marie was sitting at a desk that was next to the bed, and Jamie had a cup of coffee. She puts the cup of coffee down on the desk next to Marie and says, I have to go use the bathroom. She turns around, she walks out, she comes back, and Marie has her head down in her homework. She's not apparently paying attention to anything around her. And Jamie walks in and sees that the cup of coffee that had been sitting on the desk has now been thrown all over her bed. And there's only been one person inside of the room, and that's been Marie. She's like, Marie, what are you doing? Why'd you throw my coffee all over the bed? And Marie pokes her head up and she's like, what are you talking about? And she looks over at the coffee and she's just as surprised as Jamie is. She's like, I didn't do that. Jamie doesn't believe Marie. She's mad at her because Jamie believed that Marie was the one responsible for placing the cans and everything all over the house. And so this was just another example of her trying to get attention or something like that. Jamie leaves the room to get some bleach. She comes back and she puts the bleach down on her dresser. She had all her drawers open with her clothes out. And she has this bottle of bleach sitting right at the top of this dresser. And so she goes over to the bed, picks up the cup itself that had the coffee. She puts that back on the table, turns around to get the bleach, and the cap has been turned off and it's now dumping bleach all over her clothes. It's just pouring out. Marie had been sitting in the chair the whole time, and Jamie had seen her the whole time. And so when she sees the bleach dumping all over her clothes, she knows it could not have been Marie. So she screams. Marie looks over. She sees what's going on. She screams. Susan hears this and comes charging in the room and she's like, what's going on? The girls can't describe what's going on. And as they're standing there, a picture frame falls off the wall. And it startles them all. They're looking over and then another picture falls. It's one thing to have one picture fall, but to have two fall in close succession to one another, that's not a coincidence. Susan sees the pictures fall. She hears her kids in hysterics and they run out of there. They get in the car and actually just leave the house because the girls just did not want to be there. This was a big moment in this story because to this point, Jamie, without saying anything, believed Marie was responsible for placing everything around the house and making a mess in the house. Marie felt the same way about Jamie. Again, they didn't say it to each other, but it's how they rationalized it. Susan was doing the same thing, but for both of the kids. She basically believed that either Marie or Jamie had placed the cans all over the house. Now, Susan is starting to believe that something else is going on in the house, and Marie and Jamie absolutely believe something is going on in the house. They actually suggested that we believe our house is haunted. At some point after driving around, Susan and Jamie and Marie go back to the house. Matt has been at work the whole time, so he's not there. When they get back to the house is once again covered in cans all up the stairs, placed in weird orientations on the ground, things in the microwave. The fridge has been opened, all the food's been dumped out. There's liquids all over the wall, and they hadn't been there, and neither had Matt. Now combine it with the fact that you just had this coffee and bleach incident and the picture's fallen off the wall. They're talking about the house being haunted. You can imagine what it was like to walk into that house and see it like that all over again when it could not have been Jamie or Marie or Susan. When Matt came home that night, he was just more convinced that it had to have been Marie or Jamie or even Susan, because Susan's acting like something's going on here, something paranormal's going on here, and he wasn't there. He didn't see the coffee and bleach incident. He didn't see the pictures falling off the wall. And now he sees his girlfriend kind of buying into this idea that it's some paranormal thing. He was a really intense skeptic and was just absolutely unwilling to see this as anything other than a bad prank that now his girlfriend is even getting in on. It causes a huge fight between him and Susan. He's like, why are you letting the kids doing this? Why are you feeding into this? She's saying, you don't get it. There's something wrong with this house. Practically at each other's throats, they pick the house up again. It takes forever. They put everything back. And by the end of it, it's like no one wants to talk to each other. The kids are fighting with each other. Susan and Matt practically hate each other. And that's how that night wraps up. That night, all the power went out in the house. And all they heard all night was doors banging nonstop. And their stove is set to light. So all you hear is that clicking sound. They couldn't get it to turn off. I mean, right in front of them. There's all this paranormal activity and they're recording it. And they have no idea what to do. Even though we view this story and say, come on, guys. Either this is an elaborate hoax or you gotta go to the police. You gotta do something right here. You're doing it wrong. You're in denial. You're fighting with each other. You can't do that. You gotta do something about this. But now put yourself in their position. Their world has been completely turned upside down. Everything they believed and understood about the world is being questioned right now. They are trying to hold on to every last shred of that former life and understanding of life that they had before this haunting began. And so they don't handle this well. They just continue to fight and to be at each other's throats, blaming each other for all the things that are blatantly happening in front of them that have nothing to do with Matt, Susan, Jamie, or Marie. So at this point, Susan and Matt and the girls have not told any of their friends or other family members about what's going on. So the next day, Susan would actually go to her close friend and say, here's what's going on, and I have no idea what to do. And her friend would say, maybe you ought to try giving it a peace offering. Maybe this thing in your house, feels like you're intruding. And if you offer some sort of peace offering to demonstrate that you mean no harm, that you want to coexist, that maybe it'll get along with you. Maybe it'll stop. So whether this was good advice or not, we don't know. But Susan finally has something that she has control over. And she really gets into this. She gets the girls. She knows Matt's going to be out for the day at work. And she knows Matt would not be cool with doing this. He would not believe that offering a peace offering is going to do any good. It would just cause more fights. And so she saw this window of time to take the girls and do this peace offering. She had this little figurine. It was a cat figurine. Susan loved cats, and she figured that a cat represented something she loved. And so it would be the perfect kind of deliberate, intentional offering showing that she means no harm, they mean no harm. Let's kind of call a truce here. And she puts candles on this table, and she puts the cat right in the middle, and she doesn't know what to say or how to do it. And the girls are just sitting there like, what's happening here? And Susan just kind of says, please accept this gift. It's my gift to you. We mean no harm, and we want to coexist. And it just so happens that as they're performing this kind of ritual, Matt came home. He had not slept the night before. It had been a really bad night with the slamming of doors and all that craziness. And so he left work early. He called in sick, basically. And he comes into the house and literally sees Susan doing this kind of ritual with his daughter and his stepdaughter. And he immediately goes to absolutely not. We're not going to go to trying to interact with this thing. We're not going to act like it's real. It's not real. And so he goes over and he kind of picks up on what they're doing, that this cat figurine is at the center of attention. And, Susan and the girls are telling him, don't do anything, don't touch it. And he takes the figurine and he walks out to the back deck and he throws it onto their backyard. And Susan and the girls are crying because they're like, oh my gosh, you're gonna make this so much worse. Everybody's attention is towards the backyard. When they all turn around to look at the mantle, Matt thinking he had solved the problem, there is a figurine, an identical one of the cat that's sitting on the table again. They all gasp, they can't believe it. And it doesn't make any sense. They watched Matt throw the figurine. Matt doesn't care. Picks it up and throws it on the ground and smashes it right then and there. And it's just this crazy sequence of events that when you hear the firsthand interviews with Susan, she can barely describe this moment because you're seeing something reappear. And then Matt is destroying it. It's like a very deliberate, aggressive act towards this thing in the house. The very opposite of what it was meant to do. And Susan would say that she knew they were going to go through hell for that. That night, after everybody finally fell asleep, Jamie wakes up in the middle of the night and goes down into the kitchen to get a snack. When she goes in there, she sees written all over the walls, everywhere, is the word cat. Everywhere. And she immediately runs upstairs. She gets her mom, she gets Matt and Marie. Everybody sees that there's this word cat written everywhere. Matt looks at Jamie and says, you're the one that found this. You did this. Susan comes to defend Jamie and says, you're the one, Matt, that smashed the cat figurine. There's no wonder this is happening. And so this horrible fight happens where they aren't seeing what's actually going on. They're just seeing red and fighting with each other. Meanwhile, they're blatantly being haunted. In addition to cat being written everywhere, the house had been completely ransacked. I mean, everything's been dumped out of drawers. Everywhere that you could make a mess, there had been a mess made. And no one woke up to it. They were all in bed. No one woke up to this much of a mess. It didn't make any sense. They start cleaning up this horrible mess. And as they move some things aside in the kitchen, they find what looks to be a huge footprint. It is not Matt's footprint. It's certainly not one of the girls' footprints. It's easy for us to say, well, why didn't you go to the police? But you got to remember that when you're in real crisis mode, your brain will tell you that everything is fine. It will be in complete denial of things that are right in front of you because it's a coping mechanism. And so they did nothing and just let it continue. Susan desperately wanted to leave the house, but she couldn't do it financially. They couldn't leave the house. They couldn't afford to, so they're trapped. At this point, the kids are getting very withdrawn. They don't want to be in the house, so Marie would end up staying in her room all day. Jamie would do the same thing. Matt and Susan weren't talking. There was just nothing being done to correct the situation, and everybody was so upset and angry with each other. It was just a worst case scenario. So in the last couple of weeks that they ever stayed at this house, because they would leave, two major events occurred. The first one happened when Marie was home alone. She was only going to be there for a couple hours by herself, and even though Susan and Matt did not want to leave her alone, they didn't have another choice, and Jamie wasn't there. So Marie's going to be home alone, and it's nighttime. So this is like straight out of a horror movie. She's sitting in the living room watching TV, and at some point the TV starts turning off and on. So off on, off on, off on, and she knows, because she's been in this house now and seen the craziness, that something bad's about to happen. And the TV finally just turns off. She can't get it on. She reaches for the remote. The remote flies off the table. And now she's just sitting there frozen because she knows that something's in the house with her. She watches as the rocking chair right in front of her just starts to rock back and forth, as if the person or thing that had pulled away the remote had walked over and sat down in the rocking chair and was now looking at her rocking back and forth. Marie is looking at the rocking chair as all the pictures on the walls just start one by one falling off the wall. Marie and Jamie had a habit of always having a digital camera with them at all times because they were taking pictures and filming everything strange happening in their house. And so as she's laying there, just absolutely horrified, she takes her camera in her hand and kind of turns it and just starts taking pictures of the room before running out of the room to get her phone, where she calls Susan, she calls her dad, she calls everybody. She's screaming into the phone, "You got to get here, something's going on." And Susan flies home, Jamie flies home, they rush inside and they grab her, and she's unhurt, but the house has once again been tossed. And then after it all kind of settles down, Marie says, "I took pictures." And so Susan and Matt and Jamie look at these pictures. There are these weird orbs of light that are very clearly in the room with her, that are moving around the room. She managed to get a couple pictures of them, and they're just totally out of this world. At this point, Matt is convinced that there's something paranormal happening in the house. He's not even putting up the charade that this is Jamie, because it wasn't. It wasn't his daughter, it wasn't anybody. How can you explain these pictures? You can't. And so Matt decides, well, I don't know who we call for this, but I think you call the church. And so he tried calling a bunch of priests and pastors and tried to get anybody to come over. And the best he could do was get a pastor to come over and pray with them before leaving and saying, "We can't help you." And so they were totally on their own, and they can't afford to leave. They know something horrible is happening here, and they're just trapped. And finally, the second major event that occurred in those final 2 weeks happened to Jamie when she was home alone. Jamie was in her room and she starts hearing pounding on her door. She started filming this pounding on her door. There's no one home with her. And you just hear in her voice that she's terrified and someone is pounding over and over on the door, on her bedroom door. And at some point she knows she has to go into the hall. And so she goes over to the door. She's building the strength to reach down and open the door. And as soon as her hand would go near the doorknob, the pounding on the other side of the door would stop. Like it knew she was about to come out into the hall. And so she didn't open the door, and she went back onto her bed and she just sat there in the fetal position for 3 hours, listening to something smashing nonstop into the door. At some point, the banging stops. And after a few minutes of the banging being done, she thinks this is her chance to escape the house. She opens the door and there's no one there. But the door on the outside, where the knocking had been happening, there's this huge dent and divot in the door. And the door handle on the outside, from the hallway side, has been bent downward. On the ground in the hall is a pile of utensils, pots, pans, silverware, knives. This thing had been using tools to try to open the door. Next door to her room was a bathroom, and the bathroom door did not have a doorknob on it. You basically just pushed it shut. But there was a space for a doorknob that you could actually look through. They just hadn't put it on there yet. And she noticed in the bathroom that the light was flickering. And she thought, I think it's in there. And she decides she's going to try to trap this thing. So she goes to her desk where she had some string. She goes back over and loops the string through this hole in the door and leans back and pulls the door shut, thinking she's trapped this thing inside. As soon as she does, she starts feeling resistance on the door. Someone is pulling back. And at some point, the string gets cut and she falls back into her room. At which point, the bathroom door swings open and she says, "I'm about to come face to face with something out of my nightmares." But before she could see this thing come out of the bathroom, her bedroom door slams shut and she hears the rustling of pans and tools and metal clinking against each other right outside her door. She knows this thing is interacting with all those tools and pots and pans right on the other side of her door. It's this horrifying thought. And after just a moment or two, she sees smoke coming into her bedroom. And so she immediately runs to the door to try to open it. And when she does, she sees that now there is a frying pan sitting in the hall that has a toilet paper roll completely on fire. And that there's been toilet paper strewn all over the hallway. Like this is a wick and it's gonna light the hallway on fire. She grabs a sweatshirt and she smothers the fire. At this point, she's in full survival mode. She knows she has to get out of this house. It's trying to kill her. And so she walks down this hall, pulling aside all of the toilet paper, getting ready to come face to face with this horrible thing. She goes into the living room. The whole thing has been covered in toilet paper, paper towels. Papers have been strewn everywhere. This thing was trying to light the house on fire with her trapped inside. And so she manages to make her way through this maze of toilet paper. She sees there's no other fire set, and she goes outside defeated and just sits on the front steps of her house, waiting for her mom to come back. Susan, Matt, and Marie were all together, so they came back and they saw Jamie sitting on the front steps just crying. They go inside, they see the scene. Jamie explains what happens, and that was it. They knew they were going to have to go bankrupt to leave the house. They did not have the money to leave, but they had to leave. And so they barely packed up and they left that house. It didn't sell. Susan literally went bankrupt, and soon after they left the neighborhood, their neighbors left the neighborhood, and 5 other neighbors in their immediate vicinity all left. All of the houses did not sell. They are all vacant. No one knows why. Susan, Jamie, Matt, and Marie, since leaving that neighborhood, even though they were ruined financially, they were very happy to get out of there. They've had no other paranormal activity since they left, and they're just glad they got out of there with their lives. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen's Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, well, come on, go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. "911 dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back. And eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, this is 911. You can't call here. You need to talk to your family. And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared.
John, please come home. Help me, I need help. John, come home.
This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her, and she's not coming to the door, and it's all quiet in the house. The door is unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms, and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed, and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made. But the dispatchers are like, no way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her. What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so, not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property, they knock on the door, no one's inside, the door is actually still open, they go in, the house is empty, there's no one there, there's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. I need my husband. And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore. And there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed, and he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her. Even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is, we don't know. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security at a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're gonna go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. Before you come back to the control room, you'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. You know, everything in the building was pretty old, and Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together, because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off, finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is, someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom, and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall, he doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes 2 things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is, that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol, he's got it on the door as well, and they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there, and there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom, and that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights, they shut all the doors, everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been, locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement, and even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet, and there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that door slammed, but the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater. Just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in, and there's no fire, but all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was, and they sit down, and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator. And he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's on the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows. But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's looking out the window and he hears this alarm, this like ringing sound going off, but the door isn't shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door, why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement, and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, there's no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door closed, door closed, door closed. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out if they're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut. One by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? Maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea. And so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, But he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him. And so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater and Greg shows up. And so they start this tour. They go in the main auditorium. They're looking around and they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light and Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we got to go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And it starts turning its head like this. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder. The piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light. No one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, you can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit. And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. And when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater. Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, what's going on? Is someone still in there? He said that he had been doing security rounds, and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the third floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was whirring up to the third floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together. They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, what? And Josh goes, there's something behind you. Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, great, I'm glad I work here now. This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside, and he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother John and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor, finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn, and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, one single round here, one single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Marlin, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying,
"Catch them, kill them."
And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words,
"Catch them, kill them."
And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear, and he says right into his ear,
"Catch them, kill them."
And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps, and he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it, but he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body, and that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody, but it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville, but they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures, and the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time.
And now, a clip from the newest episode of Wartime Stories. Enjoy.
Welcome to the smoke pit. In the military, the smoke pit is simply any odd place that service members will gather to have a smoke, a drink with their buddies, or just hang around to swap stories. And sometimes these stories are about experiences that the individual sharing doesn't really expect anyone to believe, possibly because even they themselves have a hard time believing it or making sense of it, or otherwise because, well, nobody likes to be laughed at or thought to be crazy. But since they feel the need to get it off their chest, the smoke pit is where these kinds of stories often circulate. In this episode, we are going to cover a number of encounters and other ghostly stories as told by the men and women who experience them, some of them being service members, others being from their spouses. As I've noticed from my reading of many similar types of ghostly stories, one of the most common themes with regard to haunted buildings and other places is that these often seem to be places where something terrible happened, an unnatural taking of life, whether by the person's own hand or by murder. As such, if you are sensitive to that kind of thing, be aware that some of these stories may be difficult to listen to, especially as one of the final accounts is believed to be connected to the tragic murder of 2 young children. These are stories of hauntings where, with no one else to turn to, these men and women had to call the base chaplain.
So that's going to do it. If you want more strange, dark, and mysterious content, remember we have a whole slew of podcasts under the Ballin Studios umbrella. They are the Mr. Ballin podcast, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Run Fool, Bedtime Stories, and Wartime Stories. All of them are free. There are loads of episodes, and they are all of the strange, dark, and mysterious variety. All you have to do is go to any podcast platform, look up Ballin Studios, and boom, there are all of our podcasts for you to go binge. Thank you very much. Until next time, see ya. Today's story is a spooky mystery out of China. Now, it's a little bit complicated. However, if you stick it out till the end and you hear about what authorities find up on that mountain, you will have a wild internet rabbit hole to go explore. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please move into the apartment directly above the Like Button's apartment, and then make it a habit to sprint on your treadmill every morning at 3 a.m. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 5 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Xian Tiexiong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Xian reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. And so Xian, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Xian just says, I love you. He gives her a kiss and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. And so his wife, she kind of groggily said okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him, and then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Xian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Xian's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour-and-a-half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Xian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. He was really excited about this day. So Zhen was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And he was a very passionate teacher, but the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Xian loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. That was his thing. And today, Xian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Xian lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also there were all these beautiful roses, like the flower, that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally Xian would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaofeng, mostly because on the summit there was this incredible view of downtown Beijing. And at night, the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Xian knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day because it was his mother's 90th birthday, and he was very close with his mother, and he was not going to miss that. And so Jean eventually made it to the train station, he bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat, and as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Jean had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Jean, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing No. 5 Middle School, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. And he would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so the reason he did that was primarily because he was so in love with nature, he hated the idea of wasting anything. And so Jean passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, aka his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Jean knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly, because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked, because Jean did not always walk on a clearly marked trail, and so this was his way of not getting lost. And so Jean would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus, and then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Changfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng. And so Jean grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Jean had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Jean really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Jean's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Jean told him, okay, I'm going hiking today, and I will see you tomorrow. And then he hung up. And then, only a couple minutes later, Jean disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. A few years ago, I started noticing that I was getting a whole bunch of solicitation phone calls and emails. Now, at first, it was just some random company trying to sell me some product, but pretty quickly, it took a turn and became just a succession of spammers and scammers trying to get me to wire them money, or send them a gift card, or click on suspicious links. Now, honestly, this was more of a nuisance than a real concern, because I didn't read any of these emails, I just kind of ignored them, but it made me wonder, how do they have my information? So, as an experiment, I just Googled myself, and I can tell you I was genuinely shocked by how much of my personal information was just out there for anyone to access. And keep in mind, this happened pre-MrBallen. This is like I have no social media, I don't post anything to the internet, yet somehow my data was widely available on the internet. I wound up hiring a service that basically scrubbed the internet and removed all of that private information, and as soon as they were done, these spammy phone calls and emails stopped, and most importantly, I had peace of mind again that my identity was secure. So, if this could happen to me, it definitely could happen to you if it hasn't already. And so this is why today's video sponsor is Aura. Aura is the one-stop shop for securing your identity. Aura can identify all those data brokers who are selling your information without your consent, and what they can do is they can put in an opt-out request on your behalf and take down your personal information off of those shady websites. Aura offers many other features as well that will also help protect you and your family's privacy. They have a VPN, they have identity and credit monitoring, they have antivirus, password management, they have identity theft insurance, they have parental controls, and much, much more, all on a single app. Aura is very easy to set up, and you get everything at one affordable price. I value my privacy, and I value yours too. So right now, go to aura.com/MrBallen to start your 2-week free trial now. The link is also down in the description below. Again, that's aura.com/MrBallen to start your 2-week free trial today. So Jian's wife did not expect to hear from Jian at any point that day because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Jian, you knew this guy was never late. He said, I'm going to be someplace at a certain time. He would be there. So when 10 p.m. rolled around that night and still Jian was not back yet and he had not called, Jian's wife was actually not worried because she was thinking, okay, well, it's 10. He'll be home in the next couple of hours because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight and he will be here tonight. And so she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Jian in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning when she woke up, Jian was not in bed, so he did not come home, and so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Jian's family, and nobody knew where he was. And so that day, the family went to the police and they reported Jian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Jian. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search. Mount Miaofeng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that this search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Jian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Jian's cell phone, because obviously if they could find that, they might find Jian too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on, because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone tower, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Jian's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Jian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in this signal history is the day before, so the day Jian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4 p.m. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Jian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Jian at 4 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Jian's, and this friend said that Jian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Jian had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike, although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4 p.m., but still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Jian. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain. Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Jian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Jian took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Jian had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Jian's family told the police about Jian's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. And the family told the police that Jian did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Jian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Jian continued, but nothing was found. That is, until October 7th, so 1 week after Jian had vanished. On that day, Jian's cell phone service provider noticed that Jian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miaofeng. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Jian. But when they got there, Jian was not there, his phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage, there was no sign of Jian. They searched the surrounding areas, Nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Chanfang Village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Jian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng. It was basically like snacks for the hike. And he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Jian, because now Jian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Jian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Jian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Jian, they just chatted for a few minutes. And at some point, this guy who looked like Jian, asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this guy who looked just like Jian, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm going to go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miaofeng. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mention these walnuts, and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm going to go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Jian's family about this new information, they would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Jian just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tietua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had, because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tietua Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Jian could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Jian would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because as they're moving, they're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there was some used water bottles, and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tietua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case, love to everyone who passes by." Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe, albeit I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain, but, he loved being in nature, and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible, because the note said Jian at 4 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Tietua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, Jian has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him, and so it really should have been written in the first person. My name is Jian, I am lost, here's what I'm doing. But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward, and then the very final line, which says, "Love to everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So "love to everyone who passes by" is the translation into English, and that basically makes sense to us, like that's not an awkward phrase. But if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, "I take the bus to work," but instead I said, "To work, take bus." Right? Like I wouldn't say it that way, and it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Jian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and they were walking around, kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned a corner, and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff, and dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Jian's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Jian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery, because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Jian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Jian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Jian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Jian went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? I mean, we don't know. But what started to happen since Jian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own, and the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe, and he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there, they're coming up here, what's going on?" But the axe man, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there." And the axe man again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tietua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left, and they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously we have no way of verifying these other hikers' stories about what they saw on Tietua Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Jian's story, it really makes you wonder, what's going on up there? The official search for Jian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Jian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made. Before you go, I just wanted to point out that we sell merch, official Mr. Ballin merch, year-round at shopmrballin.com. We do the limited drop model for holidays and special events, and we'll create special things that come out on those drops. But in between those drops, I just want you all to know that we always have the Ballin Basics line available at shopmrballin.com. And that includes things like t-shirts, crew necks, hoodies, there's even a beanie and phone cases and more. So go check it out, shopmrballin.com. We have merch year round. And actually, one design that just came out that's on sale right now, and it's I think one of my very favorite pieces of merch, is this shirt right here. It's a graphic t-shirt based on the Headless Valley, one of the best episodes I think that we put out on YouTube. The back is like a movie poster for the Headless Valley episode. And so this is a great shirt. I wear it all the time when I'm not wearing flannel, of course. And again, it's on sale right now at shopmrballin.com. All you have to do is use the code HEADLESS20 at checkout and you get 20% off this bad boy right here. But you gotta hurry because that code is only good until 11:59 p.m. on May 7th. After that, the discount's gone. The shirt's still there, but the discount is not. So again, merch year-round with our Ballin Basics line at shopmrballin.com. And right now, you can buy this Headless Valley story tee for 20% off by using the Headless20 code at checkout. So go to shopmrballin.com and get your Mr. Ballin merch. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure you check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories right now that sound an awful lot like this one, but many of them are only on the podcast. They are not available on YouTube. So again, that podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast, and you can listen to it on any podcast platform. Thank you so much. Until next time, see ya. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. On May 22nd, 1993, a man named Kurt was carrying some boxes into his new home. He had just moved into this 2-story house along with his fiancée, whose name was Kim. Kurt went into the house and he dropped the boxes in the foyer, and then he turned back to head back down to the car to get another load. And as he walked down the steps, he passed his fiancée Kim, and they smiled at each other. She was making her way up, he was making his way down. But seconds after they passed each other, right as Kurt got back to the car, he felt this incredible pressure and blast wave hit him in the back that almost sent him flying. And then when Kurt turned around, he could not believe what he saw. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace their toothpaste with numbing cream. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Friday, May 21st, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kim Wenger clapped her hands together in front of her with happiness in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in rural Iowa. Her closest friends had gathered here to throw Kim and her fiancé, 32-year-old Kurt Simon, a combination wedding shower and goodbye party, and now they were presenting the couple with their gift. It was a money tree, planted in a little yellow coffee can with envelopes full of cash hanging off of it. Kim and Kurt both smiled and began making their way through the crowd to give everybody a big hug and to say thank you. Tonight was a big night for them. All their plans were finally falling into place. Tomorrow, they would pack all of Kurt's belongings into their car, and they would drive 230 miles south from the place where he had been living in Iowa to the city of Bloomington, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, where Kim already lived. And in Bloomington, they would begin their new life together as a soon-to-be married couple, raising Kim's 2 children from previous relationships. It had been a whirlwind 8 months since they had first met on actually a blind date. Kim had known almost immediately that Kurt really was something special, but it hadn't been easy for them to get to this point. They both had almost no money. Kurt was studying to be a Presbyterian minister and living in Iowa to finish seminary school. And Kim was a single mom living in Bloomington who had just recently quit her office job because her coworker was sexually harassing her. She'd taken on off-the-books work as a hairdresser and house cleaner, but she still had to rely on public assistance to make ends meet. The long-distance relationship itself was also just exhausting, with all the driving back and forth. And it didn't help that Kim had contentious relationships with the fathers of both of her kids. Her 1-year-old son's father, Dale Fosdick, was always late with his child support payments, and he still acted like he was entitled to walk right into Kim's house anytime he wanted. Kurt had actually recently confronted him about doing that and told him to stop, which Dale did not seem to appreciate. Her 7-year-old daughter's father, Todd Wenger, really wasn't much better. Todd fought with Kim all the time over their custody arrangement, and he and her other ex, Dale, were actually friends, which really annoyed Kim. But now, as somebody handed Kim a piece of cake in the church basement, all those problems seemed like they were about to get a whole lot smaller. Kurt was moving in, and Kim was about to get her whole life organized. Waiting for her at home in Bloomington, she had a whole collection of modern bride magazines so she could plan their wedding, and she and Kurt were actually talking about Kurt maybe adopting her son. And she knew Kurt could very quickly get a job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor, and they could maybe save some money by only having to pay for one residence now. And this money tree they were getting was a sweet start. I mean, Kim knew that the members of the congregation were not wealthy people by any stretch. But, she found it very touching that they'd pooled their limited resources to give her and Kurt such a wonderful send-off. The only thing that could make this moment any better would be if Kim's mother, Cricket, was there. But unfortunately, Kim and Cricket were estranged. Kim wished she could be closer to her mother, but Cricket had a mean streak, and for some reason, she really hated Kurt. Kem finished her cake and then checked the time, and she realized, it was time to go, so she tapped Kurt on the shoulder as he was speaking to some friends. They had a lot left to pack tomorrow morning, and they had a long drive ahead of them. So Kem and Kurt made their goodbyes and then headed out of the church holding hands. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd, and Kem and Kurt spent the first part of the day packing and then the second part driving. And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's two-story house in Bloomington, the home they would now share together. Kem just sat for a second in the passenger seat while Kurt got out of the car and opened up the trunk. They had a lot of stuff to carry in, but Kem was just exhausted and frankly didn't feel like doing it quite yet. So she watched as Kurt went ahead and walked up the front stairs carrying a box and the money tree. He unlocked the door, he stepped inside, and then a minute later, he came back out empty-handed. And at that point, Kem sighed and decided she better get out and help too. Kurt was halfway back down the stairs as Kem grabbed her own box out of the trunk and walked her way into the house, into the foyer of her home. She put her box down and was about to go back outside and do another trip with Kurt when she paused. There was something she didn't recognize on the floor of the foyer that had not been there when she had left for Iowa. Kurt was outside, facing away from the house, when an intense wave of pressure hit him from behind. And nearly at the exact same time, this booming sound like some kind of explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward almost uncontrollably and then whipped around and called out for Kem. But his ears were ringing now and he couldn't really tell if she had answered. There was smoke pouring out from the front door of their house, and instinctively he just ran into the house, into the foyer to go find Kem. When he got in there, there's all this smoke and chaos, there's shards of broken glass everywhere, and also he noticed all these little pieces of what looked like metal kind of all over the foyer. Kurt screamed Kem's name over and over, and he looked frantically all around through all the rubble, but it was impossible to see. It was like everything was destroyed in here. And so now, beginning to gasp from all the smoke, he started walking around the foyer, kind of ducking below the smoke as best as he could, and that's when he saw legs on the floor. Minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled up outside the two-story house in his cruiser, with his partner beside him and another squad car behind them. Shepard did not usually respond to 911 calls because he was a homicide detective, but he had happened to be in the area when dispatch requested officers go check out a report of potentially a shotgun blast on a residential street. However, the second he stepped out of his car and looked at this two-story house, Shepard knew this could not have been a shotgun blast. There was all this black smoke billowing out the front door of the house, and although Shepard couldn't see any fire, he could hear the fire alarm going off inside. And outside, the street was chaos. There were all these people who Shepard guessed must be neighbors shouting and running around, and there was debris everywhere. Broken glass and splintered pieces of wood and chunks of metal that had basically been blown out of the house out onto the street. In the driveway of this home, Shepard could see there was a man who had his hands on his head and he looked frantic, and he was yelling the name Kem over and over again as he looked towards the destroyed house. And it was at that point Shepard realized there must be someone or multiple people inside of the house. And he really couldn't wait for backup to go find them. So he and his partner shouted for everyone to stay back, and then they raced up the stairs into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the front foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just lots of smoke kind of hanging in the air, and he looked around and he saw there was a 6-inch hole on the wall right near the front door, and there was another hole right in the floor of the foyer. But even though he saw those things pretty quickly, his attention quickly snapped to the body of a woman who was on the ground, and it was immediately clear that there was nothing they could do for her. Literally half of her head was just missing. In his entire career, Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But standing in this blackened, destroyed foyer over the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt sure that that is exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this point, the officers from the other squad car had now come up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard told them to get back, go back outside, because the scene was not safe to process yet. They needed the fire department here, and they needed the bomb squad, because there could be more explosives. Not long afterwards, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad combed through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a bit more about what had happened. The dead woman was Kem Wenger, and the man he had seen screaming in the driveway was Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors said the pair had arrived around 10:30 p.m., and a couple of the neighbors had actually noticed them before the blast went off when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said that they saw Kurt be the first one to go inside the house, and when he did, he went in carrying a box that he had pulled from the back of the car. And then these neighbors said they saw Kurt come out again, empty-handed, but he went down to the back of the car again, and he appeared to put something in the trunk. And at the same time, Kem had grabbed a box from the car, and she went into the house by herself, and that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. He thought it was suspicious that Kurt had been able to walk into the house without getting hurt, and then just seconds later, Kem goes in and her arrival seems to have triggered the explosion. And so naturally, he wondered if maybe that box Kurt was carrying that he went inside with, maybe that was the bomb, and he planted it. And then when he left, she goes in and it obviously goes off. And then also he wondered, what had Kurt put back into his car after he came out again? What did he put into the trunk? But even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. And that was wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard did not need to be a bomb expert to know that these could be components of a bomb, and that whoever killed Kem must have built the bomb right there in her basement, which naturally made Kurt Simon the number one suspect. So, Shepard told a crime scene tech to process Kurt's vehicle and pay extra attention to the trunk. Then, the detective walked over to Kurt himself. And Kurt was rocking back and forth, and he was crying, and he was still just saying Kem over and over and over again. Shepard asked Kurt if he could tell him, what had happened here. And Kurt looked at him with this vacant and shocked expression, and he told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He'd gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast behind him. And at this, Shepard's eyes narrowed, because according to the neighbor's account, they said Kurt was actually at his trunk, putting something back into the car at the time of the explosion. But Kurt was now claiming that he had actually only just exited the house, basically was on the stairs as the blast happened. Now, this discrepancy could just be a result of confusion, or Kurt could be lying to cover up whatever he may or may not have done. But independent of whatever this was, Shepard just told Kurt that right now he was going down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, a little before dawn on Sunday, May 23, 1993, Detective Shepard walked out of the interrogation room in the Bloomington, Illinois police station, where he'd just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a pretty difficult interview. He had plenty of ideas about other people who might have killed Kem. He told Shepard that both the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, fought with her all the time. And he said that Kem's estranged mom, Wilma Lewis, who everybody called Cricket, was, quote, every kind of evil. But Kurt had seemed to have no information to offer about what he had actually witnessed before the explosion. He had stuck to a story that he had not seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard found hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb exploded on Kem and not on him, and he also denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also said he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why the neighbors said he had. Shepard ultimately thought Kurt was either the most unobservant person alive, or he was lying. And on top of all that, Kurt had refused to take a lie detector test. However, Shepard still had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to arrest Kurt, at least not yet. At this point, the bomb squad was actually still searching the house for any additional bombs, so the crime scene techs had not gotten in yet to begin to start looking for forensic evidence. They actually hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body yet. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be very busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying and questioning Kem's family members, and now Shepard was sure there was going to be quite a few interrogations for him to conduct. He'd already been awake for 24 hours by this point, but he knew there was not going to be any sleep soon. So he walked to the office coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it and thinking about how he was going to nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the bombing itself was making huge news all across Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, so less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were all these reporters milling around the front entrance of the police station, and some were even going in and out of the lobby, trying to talk to people and get any information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger, because the Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, to help them process the scene. And all that meant there was going to be an enormous amount of pressure on Shepard, who was leading the investigation. And this pressure was especially stressful this morning because the case he'd thought he'd had against Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon, was starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, everyone had said Kem and Kurt had a good relationship and were excited to start their life together. The crime scene unit had searched Kurt's car, where neighbors claimed they had seen him place something in the trunk right after the explosion or manipulate something back there, maybe a detonator. But the crime scene techs had found nothing suspicious at all back there. Shepard's partner had checked out Kurt's story that he had spent the entire week previous to the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and he was moving here to Bloomington to live with Kem. And they had found out that that story was true. He really had been in Iowa. And so this made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem was home all week and Kurt wasn't there. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given police 2 additional pieces of information that really widened the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had recently gone missing. And the second thing was, because the spare key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out at some point and had to cut a hole in the screen in the back door to get inside. And so this meant that basically anybody could have gotten inside of Kem's house to build the bomb if they just went in through the back door. Or if they, had the key, if they stole the key. So Shepard's suspect list effectively had gone from Kurt to all of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Wenger, was sitting waiting for him. With Kem's fiancé, Kurt, looking less and less likely as a suspect, the detectives had set their sight on Kem's exes. Both Todd, who was the father of Kem's daughter, and Dale Fosdick, who was the father of Kem's son, not only had obvious motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule, because each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend before she was killed. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale. Basically a couple of hours after the explosion, he had spoken to him, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. And during that exchange, Dale had seemed shocked by Kem's death, and he'd made what seemed like a good faith effort to answer the detective's questions, although his son kept crying and interrupting them. Dale did admit to having some tension with Kem, but he also had an alibi. He'd been with family in the morning and doing yard work in full view of his neighbors in the afternoon and the evening. He'd given Shepard's partner names and phone numbers of potential witnesses that could have witnessed this, and a preliminary round of calls to those witnesses had suggested that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all their interviews with very little information about the crime itself, because they didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be, right nearby to detonate it, or if maybe it had been remote operated so the killer could be farther away, or maybe the bomb was just set to some kind of timer. Scientists at the ATF were trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the shrapnel, but until they did that, Shepard and his partner would not know exactly when the killer would have been at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that would help them narrow it down. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband Todd Wenger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. And Todd seemed a little nervous because he kept wringing his hands while he spoke. He said that he and Kem did fight about child support costs, and he said he had been very frustrated with her because he didn't feel like she was always fair during their divorce. But he insisted that that did not mean he wanted to hurt her. He said their problems were common for most divorced couples. Shepard did not put much stock in that assertion because in his experience, Divorce or breakup plus money was a very good motive to hurt somebody. So he asked Todd where he'd been all day on the night of the blast. And at this question, Todd definitely appeared to relax, and he launched into a very detailed explanation of all his movements. He said he'd been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and both of them would definitely vouch for him, along with several people who had seen them during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure which of the exes, Todd or Dale, he thought was a better candidate for his killer. Both had clearly been fighting with Cam or had real tension with Cam, but both had alibi witnesses. So, Kem's fiancé Kurt might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was set shortly before the explosion, but he had no clear motive. As for Todd and Dale, they seemed to have plenty of motive, but no real opportunity. And so Shepard decided his next move should be to talk again to Kem's family. Maybe they would be able to help him sort out his flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, so almost 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister, Joni, lived. Now, by this point, another officer had already been there to tell her and their mother, Cricket, about Kem's death, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. Now, Shepard had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged, but even though he went in with some idea that this interaction could be odd, Shepard was still really caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was like way over the top. As Joni welcomed Shepard inside and offered him a seat on the couch, she was crying. Her reaction to the death of her sister seemed very genuine. But Cricket was not crying or showing any signs of being sad. Instead, she was just furious, and not about the murder, or about losing her child, or about the fact that police had not made an arrest yet. She was furious about her child's life insurance policy, which apparently Kem had not added her to as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to be paid any money despite her child being killed. As Shepard seeing this, he thought about how Kurt had insisted in his interrogation that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. Now, at the time, Shepard had not really taken that seriously because he figured Kurt was trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and lots of people don't like their mother-in-laws. But now he was reconsidering. He felt like he was witnessing someone who could be just as bad as they were described to be. And then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her now deceased daughter, Cricket went off, but not about her relationship really with Kem, but more about Kurt and how Kurt had ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem and that he had destroyed the best relationship she ever had, which Cricket said was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also said that Kurt had destroyed her, Cricket's relationship with Kem too. She said that she and her daughter used to talk every day, but once Kurt was in the picture, she had been forbidden to call the house at all. Now, to Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered, bouncing from one subject to another and just mad about everything. But he started to wonder if what he was witnessing here was not just pure selfishness and being a terrible person, but instead could be some kind of very complicated grief or maybe even guilt, or grief and guilt combined. But one thing was definitely true, which was Cricket really seemed to hate Kurt as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard just wasn't sure which one of them was in the right. But it was around this point in the conversation that Kem's sister, Joni, cut in, and she offered up a potential suspect idea of her own. She said that Kem had recently left a job where a colleague, a man named Phil Hartman, had sexually harassed her. Following this, Kem had actually gotten a settlement out of it, and apparently Phil had made threats afterwards, including a promise to get her for this. And so Joni said it was Phil who the police really should be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left the house, his head was spinning. He'd gone to Cricket and Joni, hoping for clarity, sorting out his 3 suspects. But he'd come away with less clarity, and now 5 suspects. Kem's fiancé Kurt, her exes Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, her co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. At this point, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning, and so he decided the best thing he could do now was just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe make sense of it then. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, so almost 2 days after the bombing that killed Kem Wenger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house, feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate so the State Bomb Squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and actually look around for himself. Inside the house, he could see that the foyer was still in complete disarray, although Kem's body by this point had been removed and autopsied. There were also now all these little flags and markers all over the place, pointing out how she'd been positioned on the floor and where various bomb fragments and other evidence had been collected. And also now, because the feds had completed a preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually imagine how the bombing went down. There was a 6-inch hole in the foyer floor, and Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed, right there on the ground, probably concealed in some kind of a small box or package. From the autopsy, which had shown distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew that what likely happened was that she had spotted the package and picked it up with her right hand, which then triggered the explosion. And this was actually the single most important thing the feds had been able to determine, that the bomb was motion activated. This was huge, because it meant the bomber did not have to be at or even near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually, which meant they could have left this thing there any time during the weekend. This also explained why there were a bunch of wires and bomb-making materials found in the basement, because if the bomb had been built somewhere else and transported to Kem's house in, say, a car, the bomb could have exploded along the way. So what likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to Kem's house that would not detonate as they carried it, and then they put the final touches on it right on site, once it was actually in position in the foyer. This also meant the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated, because building a bomb like this took technical skill, it took some intelligence and real attention to detail, because if you don't have those things, you can set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the table. She just did not strike him as organized enough or really coherent enough to build this type of bomb. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, both worked with machines for a living, so they were definitely still in. And her fiancé Kurt was highly educated, so he was still in. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the co-worker who Kem had accused of sexually harassing her. He had reached Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew just being physically far away from the bomb when it went off was not a perfect alibi, because it was motion activated. You could place it and then travel and be far away. But at the same time, Louisiana was really far away, and Phil really didn't seem to have any technical background that Shepard had found, so Phil was still in, but less so. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then clearly spent time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came up and they're in the foyer setting the bomb up. I mean, that's someone who's pretty confident they're not going to get caught doing all this inside the house. That's serious boldness. And so Shepard was starting to feel pretty confident that whoever had done this was either family to Kem or as close to her as family. Shepard left Kem's house thinking about how he might search both Dale and Todd's places of work to see if any of the machinery they used shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final step onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out behind him, and he turned to see a Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created real panic, not just in Bloomington, but across Illinois. People were now terrified that there was going to be a bomb that would show up on their front porch. They would see a package they didn't recognize, and they would call the police with fears that that could be an explosive. I mean, it was like this paranoia had swept the state. And so in response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked officers to recanvass Kem's neighborhood to question the neighbors again, now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, that the bomb was motion activated, which meant the bomber did not need to be there basically right before it went off. They were in the house. They were building the bomb days before. They planted the bomb in advance of the bombing. So there was a bigger window of time that they were wondering who was at Kem's house, who was acting suspicious near Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing. Those were the questions they had for the neighbors. And so this officer that was running over to Shepard, that's what they had been doing, recanvassing the neighborhood. And when he reached Shepard, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses, and there he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Wenger on May 22, 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car outside of Kem's house. They picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat, which contained a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With this in hand, they got out of the car and they walked up to the front door and they pulled a key from their pocket. This was the same key they had stolen from under the doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and they let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement, where they took all the various items from the bag and placed them on the counter, and they got to work. The killer was not worried about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well, and everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and they would not find it suspicious at all to see them there. Plus, they knew they would have an alibi for the time period when the bomb actually would go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but figured it didn't really matter since the explosion would take care of everything. Feeling very confident in their workmanship so far, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final steps, they could feel sweat beating on their forehead, because if they did anything wrong, the bomb would go off. But the killer got it all done, and they stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. And the girl looked at them and waved and said hello. And the killer, who felt like they belonged there and no one will remember me, they waved back. Well, the little girl remembered that interaction, and she would tell Detective Shepard who she saw leaving Kem's house. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now seeing Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had talked about adopting his own son, and this enraged him. He couldn't stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he'd acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to build a pipe bomb. And so ultimately, Dale was caught because of his entitlement to feel like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Because he did that all the time, despite her saying not to, he became a familiar face in the neighborhood. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the bomb, he was finally arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you about a mystery that is both incredibly haunting and incredibly weird. There are so many clues and pieces of evidence in this mystery, but they all basically point in different directions, or in some cases, literally defy the laws of physics. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice tasty dessert, a mud pie. but don't tell them you're using real mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 1 a.m. on May 16, 2006, a 35-year-old woman named Allison Rivera bolted upright suddenly in her bed in her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her home security alarm was blaring. But even though that was obviously pretty surprising, it didn't really surprise her, because the alarm had gone off at almost the exact same time the night before. And so now, in the dark, Allison could see the shape of her husband, Ray, as he grabbed a baseball bat, and then Ray rushed out of the room and down the stairs he went, and Allison quickly trailed right behind him. And when the two of them got downstairs near the alarm still going off, they flipped on the lights and they looked around, but Allison didn't see anybody inside of their house, and all the doors were shut. But when she looked at one specific window, she saw it was just slightly open. And again, this didn't totally surprise her, because the previous night when their alarm had gone off, they had gotten in touch with the police, and the police had looked around, and even though they didn't find anybody, they discovered that that particular window that was currently open slightly had been tampered with the night before, which set off the alarm, and it apparently had happened again tonight. But the police didn't think this was an attempted break-in. They said the alarm had probably been set off by a squirrel. Now, at the time, Allison and Ray had, thought that was pretty crazy that a squirrel had set off the alarm here, but it seemed plausible, and the police seemed pretty certain of it, and so they had accepted it and just gone back to bed after, turning off the alarm and shutting the window again. But now, 24 hours later, to be standing in their house, the alarm's going off, and clearly this window has been lifted up again, it just seemed weird that a squirrel's doing this? That just seems far-fetched. Something's off here. And so Allison and Ray, they couldn't help but feel like maybe the police were wrong. Maybe this is an attempted break-in by a person, not a squirrel. In fact, Allison had this nagging fear about what was maybe going on here that she couldn't shake. She wondered if someone might be out to get her husband, Ray. Ray and Allison had recently moved to Baltimore because Ray had gotten a job at this financial investment firm called Stansberry & Associates that was in the city. Ray's actual job was to write the firm's email newsletter, which gave advice to subscribers about buying and selling stocks. But Ray didn't actually know anything about investing. His background was in screenwriting and freelance videography, not finance. And the only reason he'd gotten the job was because one of his friends owned the company and had basically hired him as a favor. So even though Ray was sort of trying his best here, some of the advice that he was pumping out in this newsletter was terrible, and people had very likely lost money because of it. So it felt possible that maybe one of these disgruntled subscribers could have found Allison and Ray's address and was now trying to get even with Ray. But even though this seemed plausible, that theory was kind of wild and conspiratorial, and so on this night, Allison didn't say anything about these fears to Ray. Instead, she just went over and turned off the alarm while Ray did a sweep of the house and then also made sure this window was firmly shut. And then afterward, Allison asked Ray if maybe they should call the police again. But, Ray just said no. He said, very likely it was just a squirrel like the police said, and so the house is safe, we're okay, let's just go to bed. And so even though Allison felt pretty uneasy here, she said okay, and the two of them went back to bed. Early the next morning, Allison sat at the dining room table and quickly ate the breakfast that Ray had made for her. She was leaving that morning for a business trip 3 hours away in Virginia, and she needed to get on the road. So after finishing her food, she put her plate in the sink, and then Ray carried her suitcase out to her car for her, and then she and Ray exchanged I love yous, and then Allison got into the car and drove off, waving at Ray as she left. 3 hours later, Allison made it to Virginia. She would spend the entire day working, and then finally, at about 6:30 p.m., she checked into the hotel where she was staying. By this point, Allison was so exhausted that she practically collapsed onto the hotel bed. All she wanted to do was just check in with Ray, watch a little TV, and go to sleep. So she took out her phone and she called him. It rang a few times, but just went to voicemail. So Allison waited and then tried again. But the same thing happened, which was odd. Allison wondered if Ray wasn't picking up because something had come up with work or maybe family. I mean, normally he would answer, and certainly he'd be expecting a call from her around this time. But fortunately, one of Allison's colleagues, whose name was Claudia, was actually staying with them in Baltimore. She was traveling through the area, and so that night, she was going to be there with Ray. So Allison called Claudia, who did pick up, and she asked Claudia if Ray was around. And what Claudia said was pretty surprising. She said a couple hours earlier, so between 5 and 6 o'clock, Ray had been at the house. He'd been doing something on his computer down the hall from the guest room where Claudia was staying. And from the guest room, Claudia said she heard Ray's cell phone ring. He picked up the call, and a few seconds later, he said, quote, "Oh shit." Then Ray, literally, according to Claudia, sprinted out of the house. Claudia heard him climb into his car, and he peeled out of the neighborhood. Claudia said she had no idea where he'd gone, and he still was not back. Now, obviously, Allison was confused when she heard this, but she did not immediately panic. She figured that whatever had sent Ray running out of the house was probably just an emergency with work or friends or family, which, could be bad, but she assumed Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he got a chance. And so Allison thanked Claudia, doing her best not to give off any vibes that she was worried, and then she hung up and began getting ready for bed. And the whole time, Allison is watching her phone, waiting for what she is sure will be a call from Ray. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Allison woke up to the sound of her phone finally ringing. She felt this immediate jolt of hope that it was Ray calling to explain what was going on, but when she looked at the face of her phone, she saw it was actually Claudia calling. But she figured, okay, maybe Claudia is with Ray and she has an update that everything's fine and that this is all going to be explained. And so Allison picked up and she goes, "Hey, Claudia, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" And Claudia said, "Your husband has not come home yet. I have no idea what's going on with him, but I have to leave. I have to go to the airport." At this point, Allison couldn't even hide her worry in her voice. I mean, she basically was completely panic-stricken. What was going on with Ray? It was completely unlike him to stay out all night, miss her calls, and still not be home. Like, she had no idea what was going on here. So she told Claudia, who at this point is basically saying, "Do you want me to stay and wait for your husband?" She was sort of insinuating this. Allison told Claudia, go ahead, go to the airport, do your thing. I'm going to cancel my work trip. I'm coming home. I got to figure out what's going on with Ray. As soon as Allison was off the phone, she packed up her stuff, she checked out at the hotel, and began the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore. As she drove, she did her best to stay calm, but, she's calling Ray's cell phone basically the whole time, over and over and over again, and he wasn't answering. And then eventually, when she would call, it wouldn't even ring. It would just go straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was turned off or maybe, had died. And at that point, Allison really couldn't control her panic. I mean, she knew something's wrong here. She had this theory that had something to do with her husband. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It just felt like something bad has happened here, and she had no idea what it was. And so Allison spent the rest of the drive frantically calling Ray's workplace, his friends, his family, asking everybody if they had heard from him or if they had called him and said something that freaked him out the previous evening, anything. But everyone she spoke to said they had not seen or heard from Ray. When Allison finally pulled onto her street, she had this hope, this small hope that she would get home and Ray's car would be there and Ray would be inside and he'd have a story that would explain this whole crazy thing. But no, she got there, his car was gone, the house is empty, and she just knew something is definitely wrong. And so she turned right around and drove to the police station. However, when Allison reported her husband was missing to the police, it was immediately clear to her that the police were not really that concerned. Ray was an adult who had apparently left the house of his own volition. He also hadn't even been gone for a full 24 hours yet. So the police took down Allison's report and they did tell her they would look for him. But she just felt like they were not nearly as concerned as she was. But Allison and Ray's friends and family were definitely concerned. And over the next few days, they flocked to Baltimore to support Allison and also to help look for Ray. They drove all around the city, literally looking for Ray, but they didn't see any sign of him anywhere. They called local hospitals and asked about any John Does who maybe had come in, but none of them matched Ray's description. They also checked Ray's bank records, but he hadn't used any of his cards since he had disappeared. And as days passed with no new information and no new updates from police, Allison only got more and more desperate. And so finally, one afternoon, a couple of days after Ray first went missing, she just started looking through her own house, looking for any clues about where Ray had gone. And eventually, when she was in that room where Ray had been on his computer, when Claudia had heard him, swear into the phone and bolt out of the house, in that room at Ray's desk, she did find something strange. It was this piece of paper that was folded up really small, and it was wrapped in plastic, and it was taped to the back of his computer monitor. And so Allison peeled off the tape, she opened up the bag, and she unwrapped the paper. And what she found is it was a typed letter addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. And then the actual contents of this letter made absolutely no sense. It referenced some kind of secret society called the Council. It talked about secrets and some kind of game, and it also contained 3 lists. One with technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was one with a bunch of movie titles that seemed to be completely random. And also there was one with names of real people, but they included celebrities and also some of Ray's family members. Now, to any random person, this note would have probably looked pretty unhinged, maybe even like a possible manifestation of serious mental illness. But to Allison, it actually didn't read that way. She knew Ray was very interested in conspiracies and secret societies from a creative standpoint. And so after a brief moment of confusion when she first read this thing, she decided, maybe this document was him collecting ideas for a new screenplay. It wouldn't have surprised her at all if he was trying to write a script about the Council, whatever that was. But what did surprise Allison was the way this letter was printed, folded up, and then taped to the computer. It just seemed so weird. So Allison actually took the note to the police station and handed it over to the officer in charge of Ray's case. The officer took it as evidence and said they'd be in touch with her about it. But they weren't in touch, and more days went by and Ray didn't show up, and there were no updates from police, and so Allison really didn't know what to do. But then on May 22nd, so 6 days after Ray disappeared, Allison was at home when she got her call from her parents. They said they'd been driving around the city looking for Ray, and they had found something. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you. For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders, often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp. With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026. A few minutes later, Allison skidded into a parking lot in downtown Baltimore and parked her car right next to her parents' car. The area was swarming with police officers and news vans, and through this chaotic crowd, Allison could see what they were all looking at. It was Ray's car. And so Allison jumped out of her vehicle and she ran to the nearest police officer and she asked them what was going on. And they told her, after Allison's parents had called her about Ray's car, that was the thing they had found, they'd called the police and officers had come to investigate. And they discovered that Ray's car had a parking ticket on the windshield that showed it had been parked in this lot for 6 days, so since the evening of May 16th, which meant Ray's car had been right here since the night he'd gone missing, which was May 16th. The officer told her that none of Ray's belongings, like his phone or his money clip, were inside the vehicle, and there was no sign of a break-in, so they weren't stolen from the vehicle. So, on the surface, it appeared that on the night Ray went missing, he'd driven here, parked in this lot, gotten out, but after that, nobody knows what happened. This discovery sent Allison's fear and panic to a whole new level, and it also seemed to make the police and the public take Ray's disappearance much more seriously. All of a sudden, people all over the city were looking for Ray. And 2 days later, on May 24th, so this is 8 days into Ray's disappearance, a volunteer search party decided to go onto the roof of a downtown parking garage to get a better view of the city to help with their search for Ray. And when they got up there, they saw something that, if it had to do with Ray, it was very dark. And so they called the police. Adjacent to this parking garage was a historic building called the Belvedere. It used to be a hotel, but now it was just a condo complex. The Belvedere, at its highest point, was 13 stories high. But it also had a smaller section that was still a part of the Belvedere that was just 2 stories high, and they kind of butted up against the 13-story section. From the top of the parking garage where the search party was, they could see the Belvedere, of course, but they could also look down and see the roof of the smaller section of the Belvedere. They could see the very top of that building. And on the roof, they saw 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a cell phone, and a very obvious hole in the roof. Within the hour, a detective named Michael Bayer and a team of Baltimore PD officers followed a concierge down the hallway of the Belvedere Hotel building. When Detective Bayer and his team had arrived, they'd asked the building staff about a hole in the roof of that 2-story section of the Belvedere, but none of them knew what the police were talking about. The employees said that that 2-story section of the hotel where the hole apparently was closed off and had been for a long time, so nobody, at least none of them, had gone over there, not anytime recently, and so they really couldn't speak to there being a hole or not. It was possible, but nobody knew. And on top of that, nobody, not staff or guests, had reported seeing or hearing anything strange in the last week and a half, so there was no indication that damage had been done really anywhere in the hotel. But now, the concierge led Detective Bayer and his team down several winding hallways and through a series of locked doors until eventually they reached the room that corresponded to where the hole in the roof was. And as soon as the concierge unlocked that door that would lead into that room, Detective Bayer and his team were hit by a horrible smell. They went inside to this big, large, empty room that looked like it once had been a conference room, and daylight was streaming down through the hole in the roof. And the light was shining directly on Ray Rivero's body. Ray was lying on the floor, face up, surrounded by dried blood, and his body was mangled. One of his legs had been broken so badly that the bones were sticking up at odd angles, and he was very badly decomposed, and so obviously was responsible for the smell. At first glance, Detective Bayer is looking at Ray's body, he's looking at the roof, and he's thinking, okay, clearly Ray, fell through the roof down here. That's how he's got here. He came through the roof. But when police examined the hole, and also those items that the search party had literally seen from their vantage point on the roof, the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then also when they did an autopsy on Ray's body, they realized that it actually was physically impossible for Ray to have come through the hole into this room. Because there were only 3 possible places that Ray could have fallen or jumped from to land on the Belvedere's roof where the hole was. And none of them made sense when compared to the evidence that police had. The first possibility was that Ray had fallen or jumped from the very top of the Belvedere, which is 13 stories tall. A fall from that height would definitely have killed him and caused the devastating injuries found in the autopsy, like broken legs, a broken skull, broken ribs. But the edge of the 13th story roof was 45 feet away horizontally from the hole in the 2nd story roof. And so from a physics perspective, it was basically impossible that Ray could have somehow gone fast enough and then leapt off the roof as fast and as far as he could, that he could have carried himself 45 feet forward before plummeting down and hitting the roof. That's just too far of a distance for a person to jump. The second possibility was that Ray maybe had gone off of a thin decorative ledge that wrapped around the outside of the Belvedere on the 11th floor. If Ray fell from there, he could have landed in the spot where the hole was. However, that ledge was impossible to access without first going through a privately owned condo or office. Ray would have had to be physically let in, but again, nobody in any part of the building had reported seeing or interacting with him. And the third possibility was that Ray had gone off the top of that same parking garage that the search party had been at. It was close enough horizontally that, Ray could have landed in the spot where the hole was. But the very top of that parking garage was only about 20 feet above the second-story roof of the Belvedere, which was obviously enough of a height to fall to have serious damage done to your body, but that's not enough of a fall to cause the extreme injuries that were found on Ray's body. It just wasn't enough. And then to make this whole situation even stranger, when police examined those items that were found on the roof, Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and cell phone, they found that all the items were not, helter-skelter, sort of cast around as if he blasted through the roof and everything fell off of him. No, they were sort of organized, placed neatly on the roof like they had been staged on purpose. And also, Ray's glasses and phone were not damaged at all. So it just sort of begged the question, how could this have happened? How did he fall in the first place? How did he wind up in this room? But even if you identify where he fell from or how he fell, how did his belongings wind up placed so neatly on the roof like that without any damage? It just didn't add up. And so the police didn't know what to make of any of this. And so they turned their attention back to a totally different piece of evidence. That weird note that Allison had found taped to the back of Ray's computer in their home. And so they sent that note to the FBI for analysis, hoping it would tell them something. And it did. The FBI said that, based on the note, Ray was likely mentally ill and experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. This was not like a screenplay. This was, manifestation of something off in his mind. And the police, this didn't really answer all their questions, but it was sort of a relief. It seemed like, this sort of generally answers a very complicated and confusing situation. Basically, this was enough for the Baltimore PD to stop investigating, although they didn't actually officially close the case, and tell Ray's wife, Allison, and her family that Ray's death, as bizarre as it is, even though we don't really know how it happened, what we do know is that it most likely was a suicide. But Allison was not satisfied with this explanation. Because one, it still didn't answer the question of where Ray had fallen from. That seemed like an important thing to answer. And two, she didn't think Ray was mentally ill, and she was certain he had not killed himself. Allison's theory was that her husband was murdered, very likely because of his job. Here he is parading around like he's got great investment advice and he's pumping out his tips into that newsletter that she knows and he knows are basically fraudulent. He doesn't know anything about investing. The opportunity to basically screw over subscribers was pretty high. People are taking his advice and they could be losing money because of it. And so it seemed entirely possible that somebody who was disgruntled over his bad advice came after him. And then also adding to the idea that this was not, self-harm, that something bad happened to Ray from an outside source. There was that strange phone call that Claudia, the friend, overheard him have when he said, "Oh shit," and then ran out the house. The police were able to trace that particular call back to Stansberry and Associates, the investment firm where Ray worked, but they were never able to figure out who had placed it or why. Because as soon as detectives began asking questions of this firm, Stansberry and Associates hired attorneys and told its employees not to speak about what happened to anyone, not even the police. And so to this day, Ray's case remains officially unsolved. But somewhere out there is the person who placed that final phone call to Ray. This person must know why Ray ran out of his house in a panic that night, and they might even know how he died or who killed him. But as of now, that person has not come forward. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, we're going to look at one of the most unbelievable revenge stories I've ever come across, but you won't even know that it's a revenge story until the very end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is out of town, secretly bug their house with cameras and microphones, and then live stream those feeds on the billboards in Times Square, New York. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around, making herself something to eat. And at some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town. And unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zivana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zivana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Zivana disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Zivana's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Zivana was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Zivana lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Zavana had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Zavana was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Zavana's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see, and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this, and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Zavana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zavana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zavana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zavana was found murdered, Vlado published a story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." Did you know that this YouTube channel is not the only place where we post strange, dark, and mysterious content? No, we also have the MrBallen's podcast, which has over 180 episodes, all strange, dark, and mysterious, that are available to listen to right now on Amazon Music. And at least half of them are completely exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot get those stories unless you listen on the podcast. But that's not all. In addition to the MrBallen's podcast, we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries podcast, which, you guessed it, covers medical mysteries. They're all strange, dark, and mysterious, but medical is the focus. And that podcast is available on all podcast platforms, but if you listen on Amazon Music, you can get batches of 8 episodes that get released in seasons. On all other podcast platforms, it's 1 episode a week, but Amazon Music, it's like a binge. So again, in addition to this YouTube channel, there are 2 other places, MrBallen's podcast and MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where you can find more new, original, strange, dark, and mysterious content. Go check them out. In the story, Vlado says that Zivana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zivana, literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Zivana had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown up front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just totally silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go, and then the door slowly opened up, and this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch, and the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. and when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother, i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zivana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zivana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zivana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zivana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zivana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. It's no secret that many of the stories I cover involve people attacking other people or even killing other people, and I just need you to know that I do not take that lightly. The people in these stories are real. They had real families and friends. They had jobs, careers, ambitions, goals, good days, bad days. I mean, they were just like us. But unfortunately, the way the media often portrays violent crime is the focus of the news coverage is on the perpetrator or perpetrators and not on the actual victim or victims or their families. When the news coverage fades about the crime, the victim and their families are just kind of forgotten about, until now. The MrBallen's Foundation, which was founded in 2022, exists solely to honor and support victims of violent crime as well as their families. And because the operational expenses of the MrBallen's Foundation are funded entirely by Ballen's Studios, it means charitable donations that come into the foundation go 100% to the cause. Not 99%, not 98%, 100%. Your money that comes in, it goes right out the door to the cause. And this year, in 2023 alone, with your help, we raised $763,420. And that money was given directly to victims of violent crime, as well as their families. And also portions of that money were also given to reputable, established charitable organizations that are out there right now making a real difference for these forgotten people that we're trying to help. If you want to get involved, go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on the tab at the top of the screen that says Get Involved. Most people join the Honor Them Society, which you can learn about on the Get Involved tab, because in addition to supporting the cause, that tier of giving also affords you perks like exclusive access to special live events with me. So again, the website is MrBallen.Foundation and just click on Get Involved. Thank you so much to all of our donors, our supporters, and of course the fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Without all of you, none of this would be possible. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.
Today's story has a big twist at the end that has fascinated the internet for decades. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over to your house for a pizza party, but then only serve them fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Japan is comprised of 4 major islands. The northernmost island is called Hokkaido, and on Hokkaido there is this beautiful national park called Daisetsuzan that is nicknamed the Playground of the Gods, because the park is basically all these huge mountains that stretch up into the clouds. The tallest mountain inside of this park is Mount Asa Hidake, which reaches an elevation over 7,500 feet, and it is a very popular hiking destination. The trail that brings you to the summit of Mount Asa Hidake is considered relatively straightforward. It's pretty much just a straight line. But there is one very tricky spot. On the way up, as you get closer and closer to the summit, the trees begin to disappear and you're left with this kind of open landscape where the trail becomes fairly ambiguous. It's hard to know where you're going. And so hikers are instructed to look for a landmark, which is this big square boulder that's known as Safe Rock. And once you get to Safe Rock, apparently the rest of the trail is easy to identify and follow all the way up to the summit. There's a catch though. In the same area as Safe Rock is another large square boulder that looks exactly like Safe Rock. And this imposter is called False Safe Rock. If a hiker confuses False Safe Rock for the real thing and then attempts to take the path leading away from the imposter, they will be led down a path that many people have gotten lost on. At first, it will feel like you are making progress towards the summit of the mountain, but eventually the trail begins to gradually go downhill. Now, you would think that would be a fairly obvious red flag if the trail is going down and you're trying to go up to the summit, that probably something's gone wrong here, you've taken a wrong turn. But put yourself in the mind of someone who's made this mistake. In their mind, they reached the landmark of Safe Rock, although it was the imposter, False Safe Rock, and so they think they're on the right path. And if this is their first time being on this mountain, which a lot of people it is, they'd probably convince themselves that they've gone the right way and just keep on going. And so if you just keep on going and you don't recognize this mistake, about a mile away from False Safe Rock, you enter into this valley that's completely overgrown with thick bamboo. It's very swampy, and there's lots of very steep cliff drop-offs. And once you go inside of this area, you can't see anything because the bamboo is so tall and so thick. And so it's very easy to get turned around, and it's pretty easy to accidentally walk off of a cliff. And so over the years, hikers who have
have accidentally taken the trail leading away from False Safe Rock have gotten lost in this treacherous area, and not all of them have come back. In July of 1989, two men from Tokyo were hiking up the trail towards the summit of Mount Asadake when they reached what they believed was Safe Rock. However, it was not. It was False Safe Rock. And so when they followed the trail leading away from False Safe Rock, it was not long before they were lost in that valley overgrown with bamboo. That night, when these two men did not come home, their friends and family called the police, and a search was launched for them. Over the first couple of days, there was no luck. They could not find these two guys. They had no idea where they had gone. They looked all over the swampy area, thinking that's where they might be, but they couldn't find them. But then on July 24th, a helicopter was flying over the mountain over an area that had not really been thoroughly searched. It was just to the east of that valley with all the bamboo where they expected them to be. And this helicopter pilot, as he went around a corner, he got a view down to the midsection of the mountain, and he saw this big, wide open clearing. And right in the middle of this clearing are three huge letters. They are spelled using birch logs, and the three letters are SOS. SOS is an international code used to signal extreme distress. People who go missing or who get stranded somewhere, they will try to spell the three letters SOS as big as they possibly can, and then they will camp out near their signal in hopes that someone will see it and then come and rescue them. This helicopter pilot that's seen this distress signal immediately flew over the letters, expecting to look down and see the two missing hikers from Tokyo. But when he was hovering over the SOS and he's looking down, there was no one there, despite the fact that this was a wide open area. They are not in the Bamboo Valley anymore. But either way, he signaled to the rest of the search party that he had found their SOS signal, and before long, more helicopters and search teams were brought over to that area. And then several hours later, a search team that was on the ground, who was walking about 2 miles north of this SOS signal, saw these two very haggard-looking guys come out of the bamboo brush, and they come walking up towards them, and it turns out it was the missing men from Tokyo. They were very ragged, they were dehydrated and famished, and they were kind of on the brink of death, but they were alive and they were extremely happy to have been found. And so a helicopter was brought in, the two men were flown out to the nearest hospital, and then after receiving medical care, it was determined they would both make full recoveries. Excited by this news, the pilot and some of the other rescuers went to the men's hospital room to pay them a visit. And over the course of their conversation, the pilot brings up to the two men that they were really smart to build that SOS signal, that in fact, had they not built the SOS, it's unlikely anyone would have found them. And as soon as the two men heard this, they kind of reacted to it, they looked at each other, then they looked at the pilot and they said, "What SOS signal? We didn't make an SOS signal." After asking the men several questions to make sure they really didn't make this signal, the pilot and the rest of the searchers said, we have to go back to the mountain. We have to go back to the SOS signal because somebody else has made it and they need our help. And so early the next morning, the searchers went back out to the mountain, back to the SOS signal to scour the area all over again. And shortly after they began this search, one of the searchers found this deep hole underneath the roots of a tree. And in this hole was a backpack. And in this backpack, amongst other things, was a driver's license and an audio recorder. The license belonged to a 25-year-old Japanese man named Kenji Iwamura, who 5 years earlier had been staying at a lodge near the mountain, and one day he had left, and on his way out, he had told the owner of this lodge that he was going for a hike to the summit of Mount Asadake. A couple of days later, when Kenji was supposed to check out of the lodge, he didn't, and so the owner went to his room, he knocked, but there was no answer, and so the owner used his master key, he opened the door, and when he looked inside, there was no Kenji, but all of his belongings were still there. And so the owner thought that was odd because the last time he saw him, he was going out for this hike, and so he put two and two together and thought, you know what, I think this guy's in trouble. So he called the police and reported him missing. A search is launched for Kenji, but Kenji was never found, and so there was always this mystery about what happened to him. Fast forward back to 1989, and these searchers are looking at this backpack, they've just looked at this license, and then one of the searchers reaches in and pulls out the audio recorder and hits the play button. What they heard was very disturbing. It was the sound of a young man, presumably, who was very distressed, who was calling out for help. And it's believed this young man is Kenji. In Japanese, he very slowly and deliberately says, "I'm stuck on a cliff, I can't move, SOS, please help me. I'm at the spot spot where I first saw the helicopter, but the bamboo is too thick, I can't move. Please lift me up out of here. SOS. Here is a clip of the actual recording. At this point, it seemed fairly obvious to police that based on the proximity of the backpack to the SOS letters and the fact that the recording, which was in the backpack, had Kenji literally saying SOS. He says this on the recording, that Kenji must have been the one who built this SOS sign. He must have built it back in 1984 when he got lost. And so now that the police believed they had solved the mystery of who built the SOS sign, they now needed to figure out where this person went. Where was Kenji? And so over the next several hours, searchers continued to look around the immediate area of where this backpack was found, and soon they would discover something that, according to police, solved this 5-year-old mystery. They figured out what happened to Kenji. Now, there is no official police narrative, at least not online, that explains step by step what happened to Kenji. So what I'm about to share with you is what I was able to deduce from all of the official reporting that I could find online. In 1984, Kenji left his lodge and headed for the summit of Mount Asahidake, and on the way up, he most likely mistook the false safe rock for the safe rock, and just like the two men from Tokyo would do 5 years later, Kenji went down the wrong path and got lost in that valley covered in bamboo. At some point, Kenji stopped trying to find his way back to the trail and instead tried to just go down the mountain any way he could. And so as he's making his way through this very thick vegetation and this bamboo, he eventually gets to a point where he lowers himself down over this ledge and he lands on this cliff. And as soon as he lands, he looks over the edge and he realizes he can't go any farther. It's too steep, it's too dangerous. But when he turns around to try to climb back up, it's also too steep. So he was trapped on this ledge. And so there on this cliff ledge, he sits and waits, hoping that someone has reported him missing and they will come and find him before he dies. And at some point, as he's sitting there waiting, a helicopter flies overhead. And Kenji most likely was elated. He probably believed they saw him and he thought he was going to get rescued, but the helicopter would eventually just fly away, giving no indication of whether they had actually seen Kenji. And so for what must have been at least a couple of days, Kenji sat on this ledge expecting this helicopter to come back, but over time he gradually came to the conclusion that that helicopter had probably not seen him and they were not coming back. There was no rescue party inbound for him. And so it was around that time, as he's having this horrible realization, that he pulls out that audio recorder and he records that very eerie and distressing message where he's calling out for help and saying that he's stuck on this ledge. And then after he was done, at some point, Kenji came to the conclusion that his best chance at survival was not waiting for some helicopter to potentially come back, because at this point that seemed really unlikely. Instead, his best chance and perhaps only chance was to try to climb down this cliff right in front of him that he had already determined was way too dangerous. And so Kenji lowered himself and began climbing down this cliff, and miraculously he got all the way to the bottom where the ground leveled off without serious injury. And so from that point, he just kept on walking down the mountain, trudging through all this bamboo, until he actually leaves the bamboo and enters this huge clearing on the side of the mountain, where basically it's devoid of any vegetation besides some birch trees off in the distance. And it was in this clearing that Kenji would construct that SOS signal, believing that was his ticket out of there. But unfortunately, it was not. 5 years later, after searchers had just located Kenji's backpack underneath the roots of that tree, they would go on to make that huge discovery that solved the 5-year mystery. And that discovery was a partial human skeleton laying nearby. And eventually, that skeleton would be determined to be Kenji's. And at this point, the police said they were not suspecting foul play in Kenji's death. However, they did not release his exact cause of death. It's unclear if they just could not determine it or if they didn't want to release it publicly, but either way, we don't know what it is. And then after that, the police just closed the case and said, okay, we're done. But to the people who had been closely following this story, because this was a big deal at the time in 1989, they thought the police were kind of missing something. There was this obvious, huge discrepancy that they all figured the police were going to address at some point, and now it seemed like they weren't.
And a lot of people felt like this is not a discrepancy you can just sweep under the rug. This is a really big deal. And that discrepancy was, how could Kenji have made that SOS signal? As a reminder, the 3 letters SOS that was found in that clearing, they were made with 19 birch tree logs. Each letter was 16 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And each log, each birch tree log that made these letters up, they were all about the same length and appeared to have been expertly cut, indicating they had been chopped with an axe or some other cutting tool. And where this SOS was actually located in that clearing, it was several hundred feet away from the other birch trees. So on top of the enormous effort that would go into cutting down 19 trees with an axe, and I can assure you that cutting down a tree with an axe or a hatchet is way harder than you think it is, Kenji would have also had to expend a lot of additional energy just dragging the felled logs over to the area where he actually built the signal. Basically, this was a gargantuan task that even for someone who was fit and healthy and strong in the best of conditions, they would still struggle with this. And so the idea that Kenji, after being missing in the wild for several days, he's probably dehydrated, he's famished, he's tired, he's sore, he's scared, he's in the worst possible shape you can be in, the idea that he pulled this off is kind of unbelievable. And in fact, the person who did Kenji's autopsy would say that Kenji was not physically capable of putting together that SOS signal. He was just too weak. And there's another complication to factor in. There was no axe or any other cutting tool found anywhere near the SOS signal, near the skeleton, near the backpack, nowhere. There was no cutting tool. So either Kenji did have an axe and somehow mustered the superhuman strength necessary to chop down 19 trees and then he built this SOS signal, in which case, why didn't the authorities find the axe? Or Kenji did not have an axe, in which case, why were there 19 perfectly cut birch logs just laying around in an area that virtually no one went intentionally? When the police just would not answer these simple questions about the axe, people began coming up with their own theories as to what happened. The most prominent theory was that Kenji was not actually alone. This would explain how he went about building that SOS signal. He had help. And it would also explain why Kenji's family, when they heard that audio recording for the first time, they said, that doesn't sound like our son. And so according to this additional person theory, that recording wasn't of Kenji. It was of this other person, this additional person. People who subscribe to this theory also point out that originally the skeleton was not classified as belonging to Kenji. It was classified as belonging to some unknown female with type O blood. The media and the public went crazy at this revelation, and very quickly the police were being hit with lots of questions about this development, which they had no idea what to say about it. And so they looked kind of bad in the media. They didn't have very many answers. They didn't have any leads. The pressure was building. And then all of a sudden the police say, oh, we looked at the bones again, and it turns out they were not type O blood female. They were actually type A blood male, which conveniently is the same sex and blood type as Kenji. Some say this was a pure fabrication by police to very conveniently tie up all the loose ends of a case they were doing a very bad job solving, that in reality, those were not Kenji's bones. Kenji's still somewhere out there. We haven't found him yet. And those bones belong to some unknown female with type O blood. And she was the additional person. But the reality is, even if this additional person theory is plausible, it's highly unlikely it will ever be looked at seriously by authorities, because at this point, the case is considered closed. So as of now, the only thing we can all say with certainty is that an SOS sign on the side of this mountain saved the lives of 2 men from Tokyo in 1989. But exactly who the sign builder or builders were, and then what happened to them, still remains a mystery for many people. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house for a pizza party, but when they get there, only serve them fermented herring. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and cups and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to see upcoming deals and promotions in our store, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.